So trying to test whether changes in the state of our application trigger changes in the view without the Angular testbed is pretty complicated how. However, with the Angular testbed, it's much simpler. In this lecture, we start interacting with our components template. We add a test to make sure that the bindings in the view update as we expect when variables in our component change. By the end of this lecture, you're going to know how to inspect a component's view. And you're also going to know how to trigger change detection, so a component's view updates based on state changes in our application. Now we're going to continue testing our login component that we've been testing in our previous lectures. But this time we're updating the template so we have both a login and a logout button. So if you can look, our template now contains an anchor tag and a tag. And we will show the login text if the needs login function returns true. If the needs login function returns false, we will show the logout text. So looking at our test spec file, it's going to start pretty close to the previous version that we used in the last lecture on Angular testbed. We've got a few differences. We're importing a few more classes that are needed when interacting with a component's view, namely the debug class and the by class. We also have a new property called L, which is going to hold a reference to a debug element. Now the fixture, as well as holding an instance of the component, also holds a reference to something called a debug element. Now a debug element is a wrapper to the low-level DOM element that represents the component's view. So we can get a reference to the debug element from fixture.debugElement. And then through this reference, we can get references to child nodes by querying our debug element with a by class. Now the by class lets us query using a number of methods. One is via a CSS selector like we have in our example. So we are now selecting via the selector, which is just the a tag. So this is just going to grab us the anchor tag. But we could also request via a directive using by.directive. So we're requesting a reference to the anchor tag, to the a tag. Just as a reminder, the a tag contains the login or logout text. And through this reference to L, we're going to figure out what text is present in the anchor tag, which we're going to use in our test specs later on. And at the bottom, we have a very simple test spec. It's empty for now. So the test spec is login button hidden when the user is authenticated. So let's flesh this one out. So my first text expectation is going to look like this. So we get a reference to the native element from our L element. This is the actual DOM element. So now we can just use typical DOM functions to get the content of that element. So we just call text content, and I call .trim to just trim any white space if there is any. So I'm basically saying that the anchor tag initially is actually empty. Okay, it doesn't contain either login or logout. Now that might seem a bit strange because looking at the content here, it looks like it contains, well, one of login or logout. But initially, we actually expect the text inside the anchor tag to be blank. That's because when Angular first loads, no change detection has been triggered, and therefore the view doesn't show either the login or logout text. So going back into our test. So fixture is a wrapper for our component's environment. And through this environment, we can control things like change detection. And through the function fixture.detectChanges, we can trigger change detection. And once we trigger a change detection run, Angular checks property bindings, and since the auth service defaults to not authenticated, we will be showing the text login. Now let's use a spy to change the auth service so it returns authenticated instead. So the isAuthenticated function now returns true. But actually, at this point, I still expect the button to show login. That's because even though we've changed the function isAuthenticated to return true, we haven't triggered a change detection run, and therefore Angular doesn't know that it needs to update the view and therefore that it needs to change the text to log out. So to do that, we trigger another change detection run by calling fixture.detectChanges. And once the second change detection run happens, then the template, then the view updates, and we show logout instead. So now if I run this application, hopefully, yep, now all of our tests are running as we expect. So to summarize, by using the Angular testbed and fixtures, we can inspect the component's view through fixture.debugElement and also trigger a change detection run by calling fixture.detectChanges. Next up, we're going to look at how we can test asynchronous functions in Angular.